to start by doing is getting us all on the same page, which is that this is a serious disease that we are basically facing. So these are the statistics that I've just put up today. This is the Johns Hopkins COVID tracker. It has number of confirmed cases, so to date, which is the red number of deaths in white, and then the really awesome number as well is the number of vaccinations that are happening around the world. And so I remember looking at this tracker every day when they first put it up, wondering when New Zealand was going to appear on there, and when China, with the numbers were sort of popping up, and we were, first in the tens, and then the hundreds, and then the thousands. So it's mind-boggling to me that we're now at 205 million confirmed cases. So this is confirmed cases as well, and over 4 million confirmed deaths. So these numbers will both be a massive underestimate because there are many countries that either don't have access to testing or just are not testing because they have so many numbers. And what you can see in the red graph at the other end is that we're essentially in the third wave of this global wave of this pandemic right now, kind of up at over, I think, 1 million cases a week or something. So the numbers are just absolutely staggering. The other thing that's really, really important about this, I'll talk about why this is a serious thing, and it's not just about the numbers or what they call it's being called a case-edemic or something, so that, it's just like if people test positive, it's just a positive test, it means nothing. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the really important thing about this disease that makes it so hard to deal with is that people are infectious before they realize they are sick. And some people won't get very sick, but they will still be infectious. And so this is the really hard thing about controlling this. Very different to many other diseases that we have had that have become pandemics that we've got under control. Because those diseases had a way that, people were either only infectious once they had symptoms, or they had really easy symptoms that were, or easy to differentiate and then isolate those people. With this, we've got people present with all manner of symptoms that could be anything, could be hay fever, could be asthma, could just be a runny nose, and people were infectious for days before that, and the virus had already left them and moved on to the next person. So that's just what's made this so challenging. So not only is this disease deadly in a certain proportion of people who get it, but it's a really quite extraordinary virus that attaches to many different kinds of cells that have this receptor called ACE1. And ACE1, ACE2, I can't remember. So the point is that this can impact on lots of different organs in the body. And what we're finding now is that many people will have these long-term symptoms, so long COVID, and they can be anything from what they term brain fog, so people really struggling to concentrate. Their impacts on the heart, so some people are finding they're basically left with a racing heart. They're told by their doctors not to exercise anymore. But it essentially can impact on every part of the body and leave some people with long-term symptoms in those different parts of the body. What I want to stress is that we're still also in the really early stages of this pandemic. So what we're seeing is still the very early stages of this sort of impact. And what people like me worry about is what the impact might be on people who've had an infection but recovered in the longer term. And so given that we know it impacts on the pancreas and the lungs and the brain, the real worry is what are we going to start to see in 2 to 5 years' time? Are we going to see a whole bunch of people developing dementia early? Are we going to see them developing diabetes early? All of these kinds of things. And I think the answer is probably yes. The other thing I want to touch on a little bit is that kind of dementia and brain fog thing. So this is all I want you to take from this graph is that it's basically the results of a study done in the UK. It's kind of not a proper scientific study in that it was what we call a citizen science study, which was a collaboration between researchers and the BBC TV show Horizon. And basically what they did was the researchers developed a series of online tests, which they called the Great British Intelligence Test. And then they asked people to do this test online. So this was something that was planned before the pandemic. It kind of went live in sort of January 2020. But that meant that they ended up carrying it out during the first wave of infections in the UK. And so during the month of May, they ended up adding a questionnaire that asked people about whether they had experienced any symptoms that could be COVID-19, and if they had, were they a confirmed case, what kind of symptoms, had they been hospitalised. And so what they were able to do with that data is basically look at the difference between people who had said that they had had COVID and what their symptoms were versus those who hadn't, to have a look at their how they did on these brain tests. So it wasn't really an IQ test, but it was lots of things that look at how the brain functions. And what this graph shows you is that basically the more symptoms people had, the more severe they said their disease was, the more likely they were to have lower test scores than people who had not or said they didn't have COVID-19. And to put this in perspective, for those people who had needed to be hospitalised and ventilated, their scores were the equivalent of somebody who'd had a stroke. So this is quite serious stuff, and some of these people were people who didn't have symptoms anymore, and so the question here is, are people being left with long-term potential damage to their brains or changes in their brains after being infected? And here's another one that people might want to bear in mind. So we are starting to see reports of people getting what we're calling sexual dysfunction after infection. So I like this mask up to keep it up. So some people are experiencing erectile dysfunction, some people are experiencing premature ejaculation, some people are experiencing the inability to ejaculate anymore. So again, this is a kind of system that, it impacts on the cells of our blood system, all sorts of things. And so this particular organ of the body, which requires blood to function in some ways, that seems to be impacted too. So I think is a real reason why I would say this is serious.